Hello, and thanks for tuning in. As always, this is Reverend JR, your favorite minister of atheism. And today, we're going to take a look at an article from AnswersInGenesis.org, which, if you're not familiar, Answers in Genesis is the website and organization that Ken Ham runs. He's the guy that debated Bill Nye about the historicity of the flood that didn't happen. He runs the giant boat that doesn't float down in Kentucky. And he created a thing there. It's almost like an amusement park. It's got the Creation Museum right beside it. And that's kind of the thing we're talking about in today's article. If you'd like to follow along, you can visit at the link down in the description, where you can also click subscribe and hit the little bell to see the notifications. FFRF threatens public schools over visits to the Ark Encounter and Creation Museum. If you're not familiar, the FFRF is the Freedom from Religion Foundation. See AIG's public school offer below. Ken Ham himself wrote this article on January 8th, so I'm a few days late to the party. So let's just jump right into this article, grab your favorite drink of choice, and let's get right into it. I'm laying down the gauntlet with the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Once again, as they did in 2016, so Ken Ham should know better, the FFRF has blanketed public schools within driving distance of the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum, with threatening letters to bully schools not to bring students to either attraction. They're not actually doing that, though. They're pointing out that it's illegal for the schools to sponsor an event or otherwise sponsor a particular religious organization on school grounds or on school time or on school funds. Which means, if Ken Ham wants to have students come visit him, he has to do so in a way that doesn't involve the public schools. Lots of churches find ways around this. For example, in my community, sometimes the churches will rent the school space for their own religious service on a Sunday, let's say. And that's generally speaking within the realms of what you're allowed to do as long as it's free and it's made available to anyone else who wants to use those, facilities as long as they're renting them or whatever. But what these schools are doing in this case is sponsoring field trips to the Creation Museum. And they ain't allowed to do that because it's tax money. And it's just not a thing you're allowed to do because of the separation clause in the Constitution and so on. So, as the article continues, FFRF claims that a public school group that visits our attractions would supposedly violate the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And more or less that's correct. You can't take children to a religiously biased institution, museum in this case, theme park in this case, unless you're going to take them to all of them in the same driving distance. So if Ken Ham is an hour away and the school is only taking them to the Ark Encounter, and they're not taking them to a mosque and a synagogue and a church of Satan and so on, then they can't do it. Because they can't sponsor just one thing. And generally, religious studies in schools aren't supposed to involve themselves in that kind of politic anyway, because they're supposed to teach it just as a matter of history. Here's what was in the books, and so on. And here's what the evidence shows based on what's in those books, whether or not the books agree with the available evidence or not, and so on. Unconstitutional? In a letter sent out to over 1,000 school districts in 5 states, FFRF wrote, and you can read the section of it here. I'll leave it on the screen. You can take a moment, put your eyes over it. But basically it says, public schools and public school staff may not constitutionally organize trips to the Ark Encounter or Creation Museum or any other religious venue, and so on and so on. So then Ken Ham goes on, no, it's not unconstitutional.
Excuse me, but you're wrong.
It's illegal based on things that are in the Constitution, which, in most people's opinion, would make it, unconstitutional. Unless you're Ken Ham and you have a religious agenda or something of that nature. As leading civil rights attorneys will tell you, if classes tour the Ark or museum in an objective fashion to supplement the teaching of world religions, literature, interpretation of history, etc., well, actually, that's not what they're doing, though, because the Ark Encounter isn't actually like a proper museum with proper exhibits in it that are demonstrated, objectively. Everything in the Ark Encounter and Creation Museum is written from the bent that the Bible is correct and nothing else is. So literally every article within it, every exhibit, is shown to say that the Bible is correct. There's nothing in there from non-biblical things. And there's nothing in there saying some people believe this, some people believe that. They do it to a point, but they also do it wrong. As you can see in various videos about it, they'll say, here's what science believes, and it's wrong, because science isn't a belief, it's what evidence is. And he'll still have it wrong on those flyers. Maybe I can find a link for down below. But it'll say things like, science believes that we exploded from nothing, whereas the Bible says we were created by God. And that's not at all what science teaches, or what the scientific method has observed. But Ken Ham doesn't care, because he doesn't understand what objectivity is, etc. The field trip is an educational experience. But again, going to the Ark Encounter or the Creation Museum is not an educational experience. It's an indoctrinating experience, unless you're old enough to have critical, objective thinking skills like an adult. Children are still forming those skills, and children don't know enough to tell you that the science information that Ken Ham puts on the posters is wrong. Now, if students were brought to the Ark or museum and then told by their teacher that the religious content should be accepted as truth, then we would acknowledge that the Establishment Clause of the Constitution as currently being interpreted by the courts would be violated. That's the thing, though. The teachers don't actually have to say, this is right or wrong. If they're taking the students, in their positions of authority, to a place where those opinions are on display, and saying it's part of the school curriculum because it's a publicly funded field trip to the place. Don't get me wrong, the Ark Encounter can set something up where they shuttle the children there, and the teachers are uninvolved, and they can take the children, with their parents' consent and so on and so forth. But they can't really get the schools involved at all, so the school can't even really be a meeting place for it. Otherwise, it's affiliated with the schools. Unless they're going to go to every one of them in a several state area. And I don't reckon that's going to happen. Because that would be insanely expensive for the schools. And I'd much rather have the children learning actual science and visiting actual, archaeological dig sites. Or farm tours, and so on. Actual historical places. As educators are aware, however, it is well established in the law that the Bible may be used in the classroom objectively. That's correct. If you'll remember my last video, though, it's very hard to use it objectively, as part of a secular program of education. Right, which means you show every book and say, here's the times that represent when they were written. We're learning about the Bronze Age, here's the Bible. We're learning about the Stone Age, here's the Bible, and Zoroastrianism, Hindu, Buddhism, in different parts of the world, and so on. But generally, you don't need them in elementary school level education. Those are generally things you'll find at the middle and high school levels of education, not in your K through 6 education. And even then, doing so objectively is very difficult in a public school. And that's why most public schools don't really have any courses on world religion, especially not mandated. Generally, you'll find things like Western civilization or civics. As long as the teacher doesn't express a personal opinion about the Bible, there is no issue whatsoever. That's not true either, because you also can't just take in chick tracts and be like, hey, some people believe these kids, take all of them. You can't get away with that either, because it has to do with how you're endorsing it. But the thing is, it doesn't matter what the teacher's opinion is, because the literature itself can be biased. But at the same time, it doesn't generally happen, and this is why public school doesn't generally have the courses in the first place. As one of our attorneys, who is an expert in constitutional law, states, if public schools were bringing students to the Ark and Museum and declaring this interpretation is the only real truth that you should personally accept, then that would be a violation of the Establishment Clause. Well, that's correct. That's one of the ways to violate the Establishment Clause. Another way is to set up field trips to a place that is engaged in religious indoctrination, and so on. But again, the point remains. If classes are coming to the museum or Ark in an objective fashion, however, to show students world-class exhibits and one group's interpretation of the origin of a man and Earth history, then the field trip is just fine as an exceptional and voluntary educational and cultural experience. Except that it's not. Because you can go to an actual museum with actual history and actual, exhibits on stuff on display that don't have posted on the walls just the Bible and a false interpretation of science. Because the Creation Museum, oddly enough, claims to, tell us about the creation, but it only has one religion's creation story throughout it, one religion's narrative. And the thing is, if they actually had, this is what every religion believes beside every single one of them, then you might actually have a case for it. But as it stands, it shows what the Bible believes and a misinterpretation of what science demonstrates. And it's no place to be taking children in their formative years. And then it continues, public school officials should neither personally endorse nor diminish the museum's view. Actually, they can diminish the museum's view. Because if the evidence does not demonstrate that your Bible is correct, or that the information on the board is correct, then they can actually go and say, science doesn't show that, and here's why. They are allowed to diminish those views, if they are not supported by science, or objective, verifiable evidence. But should present it objectively, correct. That means telling children that your displays are wrong on a school-funded trip to see your displays. Ultimately, they continue, it's possible to attend the Creation Museum or Ark to teach rather than preach. Right, as long as you tell children that most of the stuff in it is wrong, and that some people believe this. Even most biblical scholars agree. The flood didn't actually happen. It was an account from people who didn't know more about the world at the time, who thought the earth was flooded, and who thought the earth was flat, and who thought it was held up by pillars. And rains happened when God opened the floodgates of heaven, and earthquakes happened when God shook the pillars, as it says in Genesis. Genesis 1 and 2 contradict each other on the creation story, but for some reason, Answers in Genesis still relies on the 6-day creation story, rather than the creation timeline presented in Genesis 2. There should be a picture right on the screen right about here also, showing those contradictions. But Ken Ham doesn't have a picture of that anywhere, even though he blocked me for asking him on Twitter why those contradictions exist. So he is aware of it, but he doesn't have it there, because he knows it's contradictory, and he knows he can't objectively demonstrate these things and continue to get anyone to believe in it. Laying down the gauntlet. Remember when the Bible said turn the other cheek? Nah, I guess we won't do that, right? I want to offer admission free of charge to all those public schools who receive the FFRF letter, and to any other public school in America, that want to bring their students to the Ark Encounter and Creation Museum as an official school trip, but again, they cannot do that because you're running a religious nonprofit, and you do not have anything to teach them in that museum. I'm sure it's a fun experience. I'm sure you genuinely believe it. But again, it's not legal unless they go to every other house of worship within the same driving distance of every denomination of every religion. So one Baptist church, one Jewish synagogue, one mosque, one Methodist church, one Church of Satanism, and so on, all sponsored by public funds. Or do none of them. Because if you miss one, then they can come back and say it's unconstitutional because you didn't go there. And it would be nearly impossible, even if you went to one a day, if that school drives an hour to go there, there's a lot of places they would have to go just to keep it objective. And if the FFRF dares threaten or bully a public school, which they haven't, they have notified the schools of the rights of the students who attend them to be free from having state-sponsored activities in a church or religious building. We have access to expert constitutional law attorneys who will provide their services to the school, which is how it should work. That's how the law works. I'd love to see your attorneys in court arguing why the school has to fund a trip to your amusement park, even if that means going all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. You know, it'd be nice if they did, just so we could get this out of the way and show Ken Ham once and for all that he does not understand American law the way he thinks he does. and neither do his constitutional lawyers. Even when I was a Christian, when I was a child, I kind of understood this. It's not that hard. Even though I believed in God, I couldn't just say, let's take a field trip to my church, because that violates the separation clause. Even if it was free, and even if the church volunteered to take us there. Actually, I would like to see a case go to the Supreme Court so that these atheist bullies, who have been wreaking havoc on civil liberties all across America, can be stopped. Thing is, it's not atheist bullies, though. You're literally telling the schools to sponsor trips, officially, to your creation museum, and we're telling you you're not allowed to do that, and you consider that bullying. Would you pay for every one of those schools for every other trip they would have to take throughout the year to meet the constitutional, unbiased standard? Because you're willing to give them admission to your place, and you want it to be objective. Will you pay them to go to every other church in the area? Or every other religious museum, amusement park, and so on? Everyone needs to be reminded that the FFRF is actually a very small group of atheists. Well, it's not small, and they're not just atheists. Some of them are humanists, some of them are deists, some of them are secularists, some of them are even Christians, I'll bet you, who have been increasing their attacks on Christianity in America. You should see all the Muslim stuff they go after. Just saying, they're not bullying you. They're telling you to keep it out of our publicly funded spaces. It's not bullying when you guys throw a fit because we want the Ten Commandments taken down or a statue to Satanism put up. That's not bullying, that's just asking for the same rights. On public property, mind you. In an attempt to impose their atheistic worldview on all public schools, no, we're saying religion shouldn't factor into public schools. If people come to it on their own, that's fine. But the schools don't need to be involved in any sort of official activity with any specific religion. Again, you're right, they can teach objectively about all of them, but they cannot teach it objectively at a place where your staff will proselytize to them. A place where you've actively discriminated against non-Christians from getting employment in. So no, I don't believe you can be objective in that environment. Especially when there's one teacher, 2 chaperones, let's say, and 30 to 50 students. And you have potentially 100 staff members tending to each of them and answering their questions in less than objective ways. You could prove me wrong, you certainly could. And I may visit it one of these days and find out how objective your staff is in presenting these views. Godless Engineer and Telltale already went down there and checked it out, and you can see their videos on their channels, and I recommend it. Any public school official can contact Answers in Genesis to book your official public school outing to either the Ark Encounter or the Creation Museum, or both. But again, the school district still really can't do that unless they're going to do it for every other religious thing. Because if they're going to bring them to your place, then they have to take them to all the other ones as well. And that's a very expensive undertaking. To shuttle 30 students, let's say, to 30 different houses of worship over 30 different days, providing 30 different buses round trip for the students to get there and back, and finding all the funding and time for that, taking them out of school for a day, let's say 30 days that year, to visit religious institutions. When they're in 5th grade, trying to learn how volcanoes work, how to do cursive, and how to appropriately do mathematics and other science, literature, history, geology, geography, and so on. That much time out of the year dedicated just to objectively learning religions should be saved for the kind of coursework, or specifically for the kind of course where that happens. Generally in a school day, you're dedicating approximately 30 to 90 minutes per class per day. And I'm guessing most of these schools, it would take more than 30 minutes just to drive to your place. Get in, get a parking spot, get the admissions dealt with, and so on. Which means you're requiring those students to use time they'd otherwise be learning other subjects during the tax-funded school day to go and learn explicitly about religion and none of those other subjects. I don't agree that's a good idea, even with the religious portion of it aside. Anyway, that's the end of the article. If you enjoyed that, be sure to give a like, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell if you feel like it. That way you can get a notification. If you want to know how to get your name on my screen here, be sure to check out my Patreon. If you enjoyed this, share it around. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And as always, This has been Reverend JR, signing off.